It is so important to remember, in a life that has been so conditioned to feel that everything has an intellectual idea, to explain it, to define it, and to resolve it. Important to realize that the truth, which is the answer to all of life's difficulties, is basically non-intellectual, non-verbal, non-material. And that if we can learn to release our tense, anxious hold upon life, and discipline ourselves to let go, that without knowing why, without even being able to explain it or define it, we can experience the solving, resolving, and dissolving of all of life's great challenges. It's so simple that it is hard. We tend to complicate simplicities. Maybe our need is to learn to simplify complexities. So for just a moment, without seeking to verbalize or in any way to intellectually or theologically define or describe a process, let's just let go in the firm faith that there is that in us which Jesus called the Father, and a great depth which he called the kingdom of God, in which and by which we can experience a flow and experience the solving, resolving, and dissolving of all that concerns us. Just be still. And we give thanks for this. Amen. One of the things that I'm very much impressed with tonight, and usually it is true on a Tuesday session here, that we have such a good-looking group of people. It's really a pleasure to spend a few moments with you on a Tuesday night. You're so enthusiastic and so interested, and you're here basically because it's obvious that you want to be here. There's an air of excitement, and of course this is always very helpful. It's a beautiful experience to me, I can assure you. So during this time, I can say that I'm going to have a marvelous experience enjoying your company. But what I would like to ask you, do you enjoy your own company? Do you seem anywhere near as nice to yourself as you appear to me? Do you look in a mirror and experience a great sense of gratitude for the person that you see there? Can you praise that person, be thankful for that person, and sometimes say nice things to that person? Or is that kind of difficult to do? If the answer is basically no to this, then it's very tragic, because the feelings that you have about yourself will certainly color and influence everything that happens in you and to you and around you and for you throughout all of your lives. Actually, in my contacts with people through the few years that I've been involved in this work, I've become very much convinced that one of the greatest and most troublesome problems that every person experiences, and emphasize every person experiences, is the frustration and the unhappiness that come about as a result of deep inner feelings of inferiority. Now, emphasize, I said, the problem that everyone experiences. I say this because though outwardly some of us find ways of of appearing very sufficient and mature and confident and so forth, yet within every person, in varying degrees and at varying times, but to the great extent all the time, to a certain level, there is a frightened child. There is a great sense of insufficiency and inadequacy. Our problem in life is that we have come to feel that one must experience and act and put on the good front, or the British would say the stiff upper lip, and develop the happy, outgoing quality, which some of us tend to master in some ways. And this is fine, and this is good, and it's very important to human relations and so forth. But the problem is that we tend to delude ourselves that we do not have any feelings of insufficiency, or to either hide them from ourselves or refuse to admit that we even have them. And this is unfortunate, simply because we're not really dealing with life at its basic level unless we are willing to admit that in certain areas of our life and in certain experiences that we're facing, that we do not feel completely confident, that we feel insufficient, that we feel inadequate. Now, the reason I feel it's important to understand this is because if you're honest with yourself, we don't have to get in a group session where we face one another and tell one another and reveal all our secrets to another person, but if you're really honest with yourself, and you don't even have to nod your head at this particular point, you will admit that many, many times you're plagued with a feeling of insufficiency, unworthiness, inadequacy. And unfortunately, there is a tendency to feel guilty about this, especially with people who get involved in the study of truth, because after all, in the study of truth, we all know that we're children of God, right? We all know that we're confident, capable, able to do all things, master all things. We never have problems. We're one with the flow of Spirit, etc., 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 all these beautiful affirmations that we express. So that how could one ever admit to anyone, let alone himself, that he ever feels inadequate? So the fact is, much of the time we don't, and we sweep it under the rug. We feel guilty about it, or we hide this within ourselves like a secret sin, almost as if we don't want anybody to know that we take narcotics on the quiet, at home in the privacy of our room. I believe that we need to take a new look at this whole matter that we call the inferiority complex, a term that was coined by Alfred Adler, the idea of insufficiency and inadequacy. And again, we can take a cue from Adler, who, building on or breaking from the old concept of Freud, and he was a student of Freud, the idea that sex drive is the great motivation behind everything in life, Adler insisted that the great motivation back of everything was a sense of inferiority. His feeling was that no one ever really accomplishes anything worthwhile in life, or ever rises head and shoulder above the crowds of one's peers without the spur of inferiority. In other words, this turns it around, and we see it now as a positive thing, not as a negative. Now we can face up to it and admit it, and begin to rightly direct this drive, this force, which is so much a part of the inner self of all of it. Some folks are standing up. There are a couple of seats up in the front. If you'd like to come up and take them, we'll pause for you. I don't feel uncomfortable if there's someone standing. Just a brief look at Alfred Adler's approach. He was originally an ophthalmologist, and as a result of his study in ophthalmology, he became very much interested in the eyes, and because of some problems that he'd had with his eyes and the feeling of inadequacy about it, he became very much aware that many, many other persons who achieved excellence actually worked to overcome the problem of inadequate organs of sight. He discovered, interestingly enough, that the great percentage of cases of people who are involved in professions where they actually use the eyes primarily, such as an artist, had weak eyes, relatively. And so this was a sort of a problem for him that he tried to solve through research, in which he developed some tremendous insights as a result of this research. He discovered, in looking back case after case after case, that many artists who had poor eyesight, going back into their early life, talking with them and tracing their history, that they had been so inadequate in their ability to see visually that they worked constantly to compensate for the inadequacy of their sight, and thus became more perceptive, more aware, peered, strained to see more deeply in things around them, and thus became more conscious of their environment and a greater sense of the relative hues and colors and sizes and shapes and so forth, and ultimately were led, because of this interest, into the field of art and became artists. It is equally true, he discovered, that many who have inadequate organs of hearing become musicians. And so he developed what he called the theory of inferiority, and felt that one of the great capacities of human consciousness is what he calls compensation. We still have some people standing up, and there's still a couple of seats. Would you like to come up and take them? There are 3 up here in the front, or do you just want to stand up? It's all right with me. I'm standing too, so if you'd like to stand, it's fine. But I hate to have folks standing at the end of the day when you've been working all day, as long as there's seats in the place. A couple more seats up in front here, folks, if you want to come right up. Anyway, what we're saying is taking the cue from Alfred Adler, that the inferiority complex, so-called, and this is something that's been overstated and it's become almost a cliche, is essentially a spur of inadequacy and insufficiency which is basic to the consciousness of every person. And therefore, if we can honestly own to it and see it not as a negative, but as simply a process that can enable us to do more important things with our life, then we can overcome the first block relative to the inferiority complex, and that's the negative feeling that there's something wrong with us. We don't deal with it because we're afraid of it, because we're afraid to own up to it. You see, everyone comes into life with some very deep need for growth, and most of us say, well, I got plenty of needs for growth. But this is a very important insight into ourselves. The realization that, as my friend Henry Drummond used to say, life is not a playground, but a schoolroom. And that the goal of life is not ease and security and the live happily ever after syndrome and the peace of mind and having everything beautiful and wonderful. The goal is growth. That's what life is all about. And I believe, at least, that if we're here at all, we're here because we have some room to grow. I don't know what happens beyond this. I have lots of conjecture, but I have a feeling that when we have no further need for growth, then maybe we move on to some next environment or next planet or whatever. But I think most of us have many eons and many lifetimes involved right here in working out the deficiencies of consciousness. But that's not bad. That's what life is all about. So that every one of us, if we look very carefully into our inner thoughts about ourselves, every one of us has many, many, many deficiencies. Unfortunately, we've always felt guilty about them because we live in a society that has placed great importance on what I call the success syndrome. Everybody has to be successful. Everybody has to rise to the top. And so the point is, if a person is not successful, he at least likes to put on the air of success. He doesn't like to admit that he has some room for growth or some need to learn and so forth. And this success syndrome is really a plague in the consciousness of many persons. It need not be. There's nothing wrong with wanting success. But unfortunately, in the success syndrome, the other side of the coin is the failure syndrome. Everybody secretly thinks of himself as a failure, as long as he is hung up on the success syndrome. Because when do you ever arrive? It's like the man who sets the quest of life making money. When does he ever make enough? You know, J. Paul Getty didn't have enough. So there was always, you never can stop and say, well, now I've made it. He didn't think he'd made it. Nobody has ever made it, because we live in a time where we have this compulsion to be more, to do more, to have more, to achieve more, to rise. Everybody wants success, but nobody knows what it is. It's like this sad tale, certainly a tragic tale, of this young man, Freddie Prinz, who took his own life supposedly over a love problem, but basically those who knew him said that he was forever in recent weeks saying, is this what life is? In other words, he had achieved success, supposedly. Everybody said, oh, what a tremendous success he's made in a short time, coming from a relatively obscure background and a relatively poor background, but suddenly achieving tremendous success with money and attention and fame, and yet not really having any kind of a definition of what success is. Looking at it all and feeling completely empty about it. You see, that's the success syndrome. That's the problem. And that's seeing it in its most tragic light. But you see, the important thing then is to know that we all have room for growth. We all have many difficulties, many limitations, many insufficiencies. But these are what life is about. In other words, what you might do sometime, if you're interested, if you can take an evening away from the television programs, turn off the set, the boob-doob, as they say, and spend a little time in contemplation with a pad of paper. Make a list of all of those areas of your life in which you feel yourself to be insufficient. In other words, kind of describe or amplify your so-called inferiority complex. And it's in the quiet of your own room, so you don't have to tell me, oh, I'm a truth student, I don't have any inferiorities. You're just talking to yourself, nobody's going to see it. And you start writing them, and you'll probably find that you'll run out of paper very quickly. But one of the things will happen as you put these down on paper. Some of them won't even quite get down on the paper because they can't really stand the light of day. Many of the things that we feel terribly inadequate about are things that lurk in our consciousness, and they're shadows, but we've never really looked at them in the daylight. And when we see them in the daylight, we can even laugh to ourselves, well, that's ridiculous. But even after you cross out a number of them are immediately dissolved, you will find certain areas specifically where you say, well, this is an area where I definitely feel insufficient and inadequate. Summing them all up, you will say, that's what my inferiority complex is all about. All right. Okay. Let's don't deny them. Let's don't say they don't exist. Let's don't develop a metaphysical affirmation and start treating ourselves to erase these so they don't exist there anymore. They're there. There needs to grow. It's like having, maybe we shouldn't drink coffee, but let's say you have an empty coffee cup. And there's no point in denying that the coffee cup is empty. The important thing is to see it as a need to be filled and fill it with coffee, and if you want it, drink it. But so often, you see, in our truth approach, we become very unrealistic, and we, instead of dealing with it on that basic level and actually finding the means through which the problem can be filled, we tend to explain it away or dissolve it away or refuse to look at it. No, I'm a spiritual being. I don't have any problems in my life. Well, as I always say, if there's anyone in the group here or any group that has no problems in their life, I would be very glad to sit down and let you come up and give the lecture. At any time. At any time, you see. But the fact is, if one is honest, and I'm certainly willing to be honest myself, that I'm up here not because I don't have any problems, but I just happen to be elected the teacher. So we can talk about our problems, you see. So the point is, when you look at the series of inadequacies or insufficiencies of your life, and together see them as, if you want to, your inferiority complex, rather than saying, this is terrible, how much better to say, as Jesus said, to this end was I born, to bear witness to the truth. In other words, these, or if you're fortunate enough to have just one simple little area, this is why you were here. This gives meaning to your life. Now, isn't that a much more constructive way to deal with the feeling of inferiority than feeling that it's some terrible thing, some plague around your neck? Can you imagine the life of any person who is completely confident, completely secure, completely successful, completely fulfilled in every single way? Can you imagine such a life? I mean, some of us kind of idealize about this. Maybe this is what we're reaching for, but can you really imagine that? A life that is completely fulfilled, completely secure, completely confident, completely mature, if we want to use this overworked word, completely fulfilled in every way. It would be a living hell. It really would. Because the thing that gives life meaning is having goals, ideals, cups to be filled, and working to fulfill them. That's what makes life meaningful. That's what makes life fulfilled. That's what gives you the sense of happiness. Happiness is being involved in overcoming and creating and doing. Nobody is ever happy sitting. If that were true, if you could be happy just sitting, then people who are retired would be the happiest people in the world. It's rarely so. They're usually the most miserable. Or time spent at home in enforced idleness when you maybe have a physical problem or whatever, or unemployment, that you'd be very happy. You could just sit in your rocking chair and rock back and forth and I'm the happiest person in the world. Tell me a person who is happy in such circumstances. Of course not. Because life is growth, and the purpose of life is overcoming. So you have a feeling of inferiority. Join the club. I have a feeling of inferiority. Maybe a bigger one than you have. Maybe the complex is expanded. But it's a driving force when we use it properly. And it becomes a means that keeps you digging, keeps you working, keeps you learning, keeps you growing. And if I am any better today than I was yesterday, or if I can do something a little more creative next year than I've done this year, it's because I am blessed, or some might say cursed, with a feeling of never being satisfied. And the reason I'm never satisfied is because I can't be, because I feel terribly insufficient. And it's that spur of insufficiency that keeps me going, keeps me working. You see? Now, this is important. I've talked to many persons whose lives have been crippled, really crippled with a feeling of inferiority. I'm not in any way minimizing the problem involved. But in almost every case, if we can look carefully at the life of that person and see enough of his circumstances to be able to see his performance, his talents, and so forth, in almost every case, you will find people that have, as we look at it from the outside, or as Bobby Burns would say, to see ourselves as others see us, who really have no reason to feel inferior at all. Many people who have far less abilities, less talents, less skills, less proficiencies, less going for them, these are getting along fine. This person is tremendously torn apart by his feeling of inadequacy. Now, how do we handle this? Many people in this circumstance, if you talk with them a little bit, in its most extreme form, the person will feel so timid, so insecure, that he has this terrible feeling when he walks into a room of people that everybody's looking at him. And so he wonders, I wonder what they're thinking. I wonder what they're going to say. So he shies away. He tries to get away from people. He doesn't want the experience. And if ever he's put in a point of being in the limelight, he feels terribly inadequate, terribly uncomfortable, and he'll usually run for the door very quickly. For instance, if you've ever had the experience, let me just put it in a context that I'm familiar with, not that that's the only thing, but it's one that I've been involved in very much. If you ever had the challenge, the difficulty, the experience, the unfortunate responsibility, maybe in a committee group or in a club or in an office environment of some kind, when you've been asked to stand up and give the report, or to say a few words, or perhaps even in a Sunday school class to lead a prayer. And there's that thought of, oh my God, what would I say? I wonder how they'll accept me, and so forth. This feeling of timidity, qualms, fear, inadequacy, and so forth. And I can tell you that in this context, I know all the feelings. I often say this, and I say it even though it sounds like it's joking, but I'm completely serious about it, that the only public speaking course I ever took in my life was when I was a freshman in college, and I lasted one day. Because I went in the course, and the professor the very first day said, tomorrow, each one is going to give a 3-minute talk about himself. I didn't come back. That was a few years ago. Couldn't possibly conceive of myself standing before even a class of people who were all there studying public speaking. Couldn't possibly do it. So, I mean, I know the problem. I'm not saying that I've mastered it completely. But the important thing is, there's one little key that I've discovered to be very important. And that is a simple little thing which we talked about right in the very beginning. And I did it tonight in a way purely to demonstrate something that I normally feel and involve myself in within myself. And that is, you'll notice, instead of coming up on the platform and saying, as one is inclined to do because he's, supposed to be a professor, is supposed to be a teacher, supposed to perform, say, well, folks, here I am, I'm ready to go. Are you ready to listen? Instead of, here I am, the thought, there you are. Take a moment to forget about yourself. You may say, but I can't, I'm already too concerned about those people there. But this isn't true at all. See, the biggest problem in a feeling of inadequacy and inferiority is too little humility, too much center upon your own ego. And that's strange, and that seems to be totally contradictory, but this is something to think about. That the most important thing is to try to get out of yourself. Forget about yourself. The person who has a great sense of inferiority, or who has allowed himself to build this complex to the point that it becomes a real burden to him, is always thinking about himself. It's like one psychoanalyst tells people when they talk about their inferiority complexes, how selfish can you be? Who the heck cares how you feel? You think people everywhere are saying, well, here comes Joe, let's look at him. Let's pick him apart. They don't give a hoot what you think or how you feel. You can walk around in the midst of millions of people. Nobody really cares. And we say this not negatively, but in a positive sense. Why be always worried about whether others are going to like you and others are going to respond properly to you and so forth? My feeling is, and this has been a feeling that didn't come easily at first, I can tell you, but when I walk into a group like this and stand on a platform before you wonderful people, and I say this not flatteringly, I really believe it, you see. But my feeling is, you people haven't come here to sit and look at me, criticize me, and say, well, I wonder what boo-boos he's going to make tonight. Because if you were looking for the boo-boos, you could make a long list of them. Incidentally, I had a gal when I first went to Pittsburgh years and years ago, and my first talk there, and of course I was feeling somewhat inadequate because it was my first time before this group of people, and I gave a talk which all I could say when I was through was that I was through, that's all. But I did it, and heaved a sigh of relief, and at the end of it, this woman came up and said, I thought your talk was very interesting, but if you would care to, I have a critique for you. She had a long list of all the things I did wrong. How I stood, grammatical errors, the way I tied my tie, the whole bit, everything, Of course, right away, there was a feeling of being rebellious. How dare she? Who does she think she is? And so forth. Actually, and this is kind of aside from the point, but it was a very helpful experience to me because though I didn't take to it too kindly right off, out of my sense of inadequacy, I pulled my rank, which is where most of the authoritative, aggressive actions of people come. If you have a boss that's very superior and is always lording it over you, it's because he probably feels small, and he's covering it. Parents do the same thing. So I pulled my rank on the woman, you see, and I was very distant and very cool and very aloof. Well, very nice of you, thank you, and brushed her off. And as she left, fortunately, she handed me the list, and she said, my telephone number is at the bottom in case you want to call me. Well, I laid the thing on my desk. I wanted to throw it in the wastebasket. I didn't, but eventually I looked at the thing the next day, and I was kind of thinking, well, this is ridiculous. Who are you kidding? You're just kind of starting out. You're very naive. You know nothing about public speaking, nothing about so much of what this woman obviously knows a good deal about, so let's at least have a talk with her. So I invited her in. Well, to make the long story short, she became a very good friend, very helpful to me. Used to spend hours and hours. She had been a marvelously schooled, disciplined teacher in this whole general area of speech, communication, and so forth at one of the colleges, and was retired, and sort of accepted me as her personal project. And it was a great thing, but I'm grateful to this day that at least my sense of inadequacy didn't turn off the opportunity through the failure to exercise a little humility to accept a great blessing that came, you see. So that what I'm saying is that sometimes, though we may think of this as totally opposite of what our real problem is, The greatest and first and most important need in overcoming an inferiority complex is a great sense of humility. You may say, but I already am too humble. You're not at all. Because that's not real humility. Most of our so-called humility is simply fear and the refusal to deal with situations. True humility is where you're willing to let go of yourself, the centering of your attention on yourself, and get involved in becoming a channel in whatever way you can to do something creative, which means to get in tune with the flow of life and to be involved in helping other people and helping society and helping your job and so forth. When you forget yourself and let this process work through you, then gradually the needs that you have begin to dissolve themselves. And suddenly, whereas before you felt terribly inadequate and terribly inferior, terribly unworthy, you gradually become a little more secure and a little more mature. You may never lose that sense of inferiority, and personally I say I hope you never do, because it's that thing that keeps you ever on the quest. Might I be bold enough to say, and some would challenge me at this, that it probably was the thing that kept someone like Jesus constantly working toward the ultimate quest of complete overcoming, spiritual mastery. That goading, prodding something that possibly was figuratively outlined as the devil or as Satan, that actually kept him constantly going on. That's something that says you can't do it. You're too weak. You're too inadequate, you know. So the point is, Jesus did not become the Christ because he did not have these human urgings or this human complex of fears that other people have. He achieved mastery because he didn't give in to them, because he took them in a positive way and kept them as a driving force to keep him working forward all the way through the cross to the complete overcoming. And that's a very important insight, I believe. At least it's one that's been very helpful to me. Thomas Merton says, a humble person can do great things with an uncommon perfection because he is no longer concerned about accidentals like his own interests, his own reputation, and therefore he no longer needs to waste his efforts in defending them. You see, you turn the whole situation around. You realize that where you are in life is where you need to be. Where you are in consciousness, at least it's the starting point. No point in trying to delude yourself. This is where you are. Accept it as your opportunity to grow and get busy working at it, knowing that the complex, the fear, the sense of inadequacy is not some terrible sin. It simply means that this is a need to develop. And one of the best things you can do is get busy doing it. For instance, I certainly believe, I'm absolutely convinced, though I can't trace my steps now and see how it happened, I'm convinced that I'm in this work today because the greatest need of my life was to overcome the complete incapacity to stand before a group of people and communicate. I think that's why I'm here. I really do. One starts in a direction to work and to overcome, and the first thing you know, you develop a whole momentum, because that really, we spend so much time, I think, today in various testing devices, try to find out what your proper career potentiality is and so forth. And I'm not against any of these, but I think so many of them are totally inadequate, because I think sometimes they tend to try to put you in the place where you have total confidence and thus have no drive of insufficiency. And without the drive of insufficiency, you really have nothing with which to keep you unfolding at the pace that will be satisfying to you. I think this is why a lot of people get into fields of endeavor where it's their field of greatest potentiality in terms of their capacities, in terms of their sufficiencies, and ultimately come to terrible frustrations. They may make a lot of money, they may become, quote, successful, or they may not. But along the way, they feel a terrible sense of frustration, often. Sometimes even wonder how they ever got into this kind of work. Because I don't think a person ever really has all the requirements if he doesn't have the goad, the spur of inferiority. So that I'm inclined to feel, and I doubt if I have too many people agree with me on this. I've never read anything on this. If any of you know anything, let me know. But I'm inclined to feel that the kind of career tests that we normally take might be best for us in terms of our avocations. And that maybe sometimes the best area for the vocation, I'm not saying an area where you are totally tone deaf and you ought to become a musician, but even that shouldn't be overlooked. But areas where you feel a sense of incapacity and inferiority and a driving something within you that just will not let you be, that maybe those in the general direction in that area is the area that we're going to find the greatest personal growth, the greatest satisfaction, and maybe ultimately the greatest accomplishments. That was the thing that Alfred Adler discovered. He discovered in his studies of inferiority that though we have brought to our attention certain individual cases where persons have had the inability to master something and then have worked at it and have overcome it and gone on, such as Thomas Edison, the classic instance of a person who was dismissed from school because the teacher thought he was totally addled, and went on, of course, to become the great inventor and great scientist, or Charles Steinmetz, who not only was physically incapacitated in terms of being a very extreme cripple, but who, in his early experience in school and high school and so forth, had a total incapacity to learn mathematics and had to have private tutoring and went on to become one of the world's greatest mathematicians. But Adler discovered that these were not the exceptions. His theory was that in back of every person who has achieved tremendous excellence, if you look carefully enough, you'll find that he achieved that position because somewhere in his life he came to grips with a great inadequacy and a great overcoming. And he did what he did not in spite of his inadequacies, but because of them, that they were the reason. And that means good, bad, or indifferent. It may be a great sense of inadequacy like a Hitler, perhaps, and a complex driving him, goading him, that led him in a negative way, certainly. Or a Napoleon, which may be equally negative. But it is the spur of inadequacy and inferiority that is the root and the basic drive and force that enables us to rise above our present potentialities, not to just achieve them. You see, no one can ever be satisfied by just achieving his potential. It's transcending the potential that gives us satisfaction and happiness. And perhaps there are those who do not believe that we have the ability to transcend, because that deals with a kind of a spiritual level. And yet, that's the thing that we want to think about in our study of truth. That each of us is more than he believes he is, more than anyone can ever perceive in us. That there is a transcendent potential within us by which we can overcome and go far beyond anything we've ever known. This is why, for instance, I've always had some problems with the so-called theory of self-image psychology. I was very close to, in terms of occasional get-togethers and friendships, with Maxwell Maltz. We had lots of discussions and friendly arguments, because I used to always punch holes in his theory of self-image psychology, which took the country by storm and has helped an awful lot of people. My contention was that it is not enough to get a new image of yourself. Because if that new image of yourself is one that you have taken because you think that's the kind of image you'd like to have, you take it out of a magazine, or you take it out of some person who you admire who has great success, and so you want to be like him or be like this person, and you kind of paste that image over yourself, and you develop all of the qualities and the capacities of being outgoing and radiant and hail fellow well met and so forth, and have this tremendous air of confidence. You may make more sales. You may get along better in industry. You may win friends and influence people. And yet it is possible and quite often true that in back of this pasted-on image is the same scared little person that you've always been trying to run away from. You haven't dissolved it at all. You simply refuse to deal with it. That under it all there may well be, I'm not saying there is, but there may well be a great feeling of self-rejection. And it is the rejection of yourself that caused you to want to have a new image. Now, I'm not saying that one does not need a new image, but I'm saying the new image needs to be built out of the awareness of our divine image. It is not really changing anything at all, simply changing our thought about ourselves. You don't have to change to overcome your inferiority complex. You simply need to take another look at yourself and see that right now, not someday, right now, you're good enough. You don't have to be somebody different. If we misunderstand this, then all along the way, the study of self-help courses, even the study of metaphysics, becomes a matter of self-delusion. We're always trying to be somebody else, to imitate, to copy. We need to accept the realization, or at least to begin to deal with it, that you are a unique individual. Maybe you do not completely understand yourself, but this self that you don't understand is good enough. And right now, where you are, even in your inadequacies, is the place where you need to be. This is your starting place, not somewhere else, right here, dealing with yourself. If we don't do this, we get involved in a tendency to constantly try to pattern ourselves after someone else. And unfortunately, this again is a part of the success syndrome. Parents perhaps are the greatest ones who make the greatest mistake, I should say, in this area, who are mistakenly constantly holding up before a child somebody else who does well. Johnny comes home with C's on his report card. Why can't you be like Jerry, who gets B's? If he gets B's, why can't you be like Joe, who gets A's? Always be like this, be like that. Try to be like your uncle. Look at this person. He does that. Be like him. So there's this tendency to feel that the only way I can make it in life is to pattern myself after somebody else. And so many of the success courses and a great deal of the inference in our metaphysical study often is directed in that way. Have a goal. Where do you get a goal? Well, just get some. You know, so as a matter of fact, some of our people, I don't want to make light of this because many people have done some interesting things with it, but the idea of treasure mapping, for instance, which is a concept that some Unity teacher years ago dreamed up, and it's helped a lot of people. I find some problems with it, only because I think so often it covers up more than it actually cures. But the person then tends to assume all you got to do is have some goals, so you leaf through magazines. I'd like to have that. I'd like to be like this. I'd like to drive Cadillacs. You see a person standing before a group, you know, very confident and radiant. I want to be just like that. So these are your goals. Well, why should they be your goals? They're not you, they're somebody else. So there's a tendency then to begin with these goals which are superficial and to constantly work, and in back of it all is a lack of appreciation of yourself, total rejection of what you are. I'm no good, but maybe if I take this course or do that thing or learn to say this thing over and over, maybe then I will be somebody. Well, you're not going to be somebody unless you are somebody. Because what you become, if it's going to be soul deep, is simply going to be the expression of what you already are. You can't get blood out of a turnip, to use a very common expression. There's no way that you can get anything more out of you unless that more is already in you. And if it is in you, then we need to start with the realization that where I am and what I am is good enough. Maybe good enough only as a starting point, but it's good enough. You're not inadequate. You may have this plaguing fear, this sense of insufficiency, and it can be a spur to lead you to greater and greater things, but it's going to use the energy force that is already within you. Now, that's important. Maybe you recall the little story. It's one of the little golden books. My youngsters, when they were little kids, both went through the phase of reading this, and I always enjoy reading it to them. It was a little book called Copycat, if you remember it. So you parents may remember this, or some of you may remember reading it yourself. It was a story of a little kitten who spent his time constantly trying to copy other animals. He tried to bark and act like a dog, and of course it didn't work. He tried to roar like a lion, but he had a squeaky little voice that just didn't make it. He tried to stretch his neck like a giraffe. All he had wound up with was a sore neck. He tried every way to imitate this and that and the other animal, and finally, terribly discouraged, terribly depressed, finally decided, shucks, I guess I might just as well be myself, and it'll be more fun anyway. And so he became what he always was, a charming little kitten. Now, it's a simple little story, but actually it's a kind of a parable of life of most of us. Most of us have spent most of our lives trying to be something else instead of being ourselves. We need to begin to appreciate ourselves. Not to say, well, I will appreciate myself when I can do this or have that or awaken in this possibility and so forth. Appreciate yourself right now. You're good enough. I know a man that I used to talk to quite often was having terrible troubles with his wife, and it's interesting when you talk to a person, he's always talking about the other person, and you tend to assume, of course, that the other person is the sole problem in his life, whereas obviously he had many problems himself. But eventually, in some of our conversations, we were able to make some breakthroughs, and he did resolve some of his needs. But it seemed obvious that his wife obviously needed some help. And I didn't aggressively go out and get her, but as a result of a series of circumstances, I had a chance to talk with her, and eventually we got into kind of a counseling situation. I spent a good bit of time with her. And I discovered that though she ultimately, admittedly, had been making life hell for her husband, and she'd become, if we can use this terrible word, very bitchy. She was always nitpicking at him, always criticizing, always pulling him down, and so forth, to the point that it's kind of a miracle that he lived through it and stayed on through it all. Somehow he felt that his wife was a little better than she'd been acting. I guess lots of times we do this. Maybe sometimes it's self-delusion. But the thing was, ultimately, I had a chance to share some thoughts with her that, fortunately, she was willing to accept. The first one was that you are a better person than you're acting. That you're a far nicer person than you think you are. And the important thing is then that you must begin to accept yourself. That you have been constantly carping at and criticizing your husband because you feel inferior to him. And you're trying to cut him down to your size, and you have a feeling you've just whittled enough off that maybe you'll be able to communicate with him. And in the process, you've forgotten. You see, you've been acting very superior, but you've forgotten that you really feel terribly inadequate. Intellectually and socially in every way, he's inferior. And yet, secretly, you have this tremendous fear of losing him. So you're always holding on to him at the same time. The important thing is, then, you need to begin to realize that your husband did not marry the person that you think you'd like to be and yet feel secretly that you never will be. Your husband married you. This is one of the things that so often happens. Two people come together, whether it be a business partnership, people who work together in their office, friends, and ultimately in the extreme, perhaps marriages. People come together because of a mutual bond, and quite often that bond is there, though the people are not very aware of what it is, or even that it is. So there's a tendency out of a feeling of inadequacy, of trying to be the kind of partner that we think the other person would think we should be. So we put on a great deal. This is what often happens in the in-love stages, you know. You say the kind of romantic things that you think you should. You watch the movies and all the things that you remember about the ways people should be romantic and do all these things, and you act suave and gracious, whether it's the man or the woman. And there's a great superficiality about it, and yet neither one are willing to admit that it's terribly superficial. And quite often, after people have been together, whether it's a business partnership or a marriage, for a while, then they tend to feel comfortable in the relationship. And they begin to be reduced to the level of their consciousness, where they really are. And now if a person tends to be somewhat aloof and inferior and timid, he becomes reticent, he doesn't communicate as much. And the wife says, I can't understand it. You used to talk with me and now you never talk. Or the husband says to the woman, you always used to be outgoing, ready to do this, but now you feel backward and reticent. What's the matter? Something is drawing us apart. And what quite often has happened is that in the relaxed sense of a relationship where two people feel comfortable with one another, they begin to let down their guard, their facade, this image that they've put on, and to just be themselves. And an awful lot of marriages break up at this time. An awful lot of partnerships break up. And strangely enough, sometimes they break up and maybe after many months they discover they still have this relationship, this tie, and quite often they get married again, go through the same process again, unless they've had some kind of therapy or counseling where they're willing to deal with themselves. And always there's this bugaboo of insufficiency which they've never really faced up to. And the important thing, as was in the case of this man and the woman that I'm telling you about, it was helpful for both of them when they ultimately began to understand that the other person was not necessarily unloving because he was dealing with his own needs. He was crying out for help. And the partner needed to understand that the person had this great sense of insufficiency and to try to be helpful and supportive. And try to realize that love does not necessarily always have to be saying I love, or doing all the little things that we've come to associate as being the romantic things. That love so often expresses itself in some persons in other ways than this. So as in the supportive relationship of friendships or business partnerships or whatever. And when we understand this and recognize that deep within the experience and the personality of most persons, there are these little quirks of insufficiency and inadequacy, these little bugaboos that are always rearing their head from time to time. When we understand this, then we can be much more patient and tolerant and supportive. And thus we can find a kind of communication that transcends what we normally think of as communication when two people sit and talk to one another lovingly and friendly and always have these very sophisticated things to say, which may well be completely superficial. You see. Not always, but may well be. So the point is, we need to work to accept ourselves, to appreciate ourselves. Not simply to say, I will accept myself and appreciate myself when I become something different, but accept yourself right now for what you are. And make the commitment that you're going to be you. Sometimes people go through most of their lives and never really have the courage to be themselves. To really be yourself, to be honest with yourself, to express yourself, or even to be willing to say, which takes a lot of doing. To be willing to say in a time when someone asks you to stand up and lead the prayer or to give the report. To honestly say, I feel so incapable and so insufficient and so fearful and so timid that I couldn't possibly do it. It's hard to do, isn't it? It's hard to admit it, because that's a failure. That's saying, because people have always thought, well, I can't understand that about this person. It's like one man was telling me one time, this was a man who was very successful, and we usually measure success in terms of salary, but he had a salary that was yay long. And so a very, very successful person who achieved a position in his corporation where eventually he had to accept a leadership role and to address stockholders' meetings and so forth. And the bottom fell out. The man had never had to do anything this in his life before. And it was the secret fear that he'd always had. Actually, it was the thing that was driving him there all the time. He had to be there. And he was at the point of resigning his position, leaving the corporation. He felt that inadequate. There was no way he felt that he could stand up before this group, address the group, tell them about things that he knew very much about more than anybody in the world. But he couldn't do it, he thought. Fortunately, he took a good look at himself as a result of some help and some counseling and began to realize that that's why he was here. That was the next step. You see, he'd always thought, well, if I had a new business problem, great, roll up your sleeves and let's get at it. And he was great at solving all kind of problems. So we had to simply convince him that this is the next step. This is the next problem. Okay, roll up your sleeves again, get at it. And when he began to understand it in this sense, strangely enough, he put a whole different series of forces to work. And he found himself very soon not only overcoming the sense of timidity, but even enjoying it. And yet, so easily we tend to run away from situations and relationships, the challenges of life, because, I couldn't do that. Just like I honestly tell you that I ran away from my public speaking course. And I've run away from things before in my life, lots of times. I can remember a time many years ago, probably too long ago. I stayed out of school, out of college for a year. It was during the Depression years, and my family needed great help, and I was going to get work and help out with the family. Looked for work, and there wasn't much work to be had. There were all sorts of corporations and companies, and some of them pseudo-corporations and front organizations that were offering sales positions. You could always get a job selling. You couldn't sell maybe, but you could get a job selling as a salesman. So I got a job as a salesman. And I went to a course to learn all the techniques of salesmanship. All the things, that so often you're confronted with, your image and your confidence and how to deal with the customer, know the product, all these things, Went through the whole process. And I was writing down and going through studying the process, and everything was fine until I had to make my first call. It was door to door. I never got the door knocked. I went back and turned in my kit. Couldn't do it. Couldn't make it. A lot of folks, I'm sure, have flaked out at this time. So the point is, so often we run away from these things rather than seeing them as the next step in our growth. And I say that this is true in many areas of life. Many folks in the study of metaphysics, the study of truth, confront themselves as they go along with the fact that I've always been able to demonstrate prosperity. I get along well with people. I feel very confident, but when it comes to my health, I've had this problem. Another person maybe has good health but has financial problems and so forth. And quite often a truth student, unfortunately, feels terribly guilty about this. Doesn't he want to tell anybody about it because he feels that he's going to be ostracized from the club? He assumes that everybody sitting here is into truth and everybody's demonstrating truth, so what's the matter with me? So quite often he's afraid to own up to the fact that maybe he has an ache, maybe he has a physical problem, maybe a doctor tells him he ought to have an operation or whatever, and he has this terrible feeling of guilt and self-rejection. Well, I say the important thing is to know that when you look at yourself, and you don't have to even write down this long list I was talking about to find out the areas of deficiency in your life, look at them honestly and say, okay, this is where I am. Now, this is the next logical step. You're no better nor no worse than another person because you have a problem. Sometimes problems are a blessing, so in a sense you may be better than someone else. But in every case, where you are now, with all the problems attendant to your experience, this is your opportunity. To this end was I born, to bear witness unto the truth. So get at it, get with it, you see. And it's that simple. It's a simple little psychological quirk, but it's so important. The truth is here, and it can help tremendously if we let go of the tendency to reject ourselves or to feel inadequate or inferior because we have the problem. Get with it. And once you are willing to look at it and decide that this is where you are and you're no less than anybody else because you have this experience, most of the problem disappears. And sometimes, almost before you know it, you begin to resolve it. But even if you don't, you will use that particular deficiency or problem as a spur to keep you going. And I doubt very much if anybody has continued on in a field such as this, in the study of truth, year after year after year, unless he has a great sense of spiritual inferiority. If any one of you feels that at the end of a course of study, like I'm giving a master course, sounds great. At the end of a course of study, now you're going to have it. The certificate, the diploma says now you're ready, you've got it all. Now please don't take the course. Because it just isn't so. The point is, the person who continues on in his study is a person who is plagued with a sense of spiritual inadequacy. And that ain't bad. As a matter of fact, it's the most important thing you have going for you. But the point is, don't feel a sense of guilt about it. Look at it. Give thanks for it. As Jesus says, agree with your adversary. Agree with it. Give thanks that this is a very important thing in your life. Then it's going to work for you, and it will lead you in ways that perhaps at present you can't even imagine yourself expressing and experiencing. Because all the while, the thing that we have going for us is a transcendent potentiality, not just achieving your potential, not just getting along and making the best of things in life to where you have no more problems, but transcending the whole thing because you have that transcendent flow and that tremendous something that Jesus called the Christ, or Paul calls the Christ in you. Jesus called it the Father within, the kingdom of God within, always within you, always the means by which you can solve or resolve or dissolve your problems in life. And along the way, find tremendous help and fulfillment, but always recognizing and even being grateful for the spur of inadequacy. I never give this type of a discussion without simply referring you to the book that I was talking to you about earlier, a study of Alfred Adler. You can read Alfred Adler directly, but if you want to get the best concise study of him, it's better to go to somebody else who's made a study of him than his own words, which are very complicated. There's a beautiful book that was written a few years ago that you probably still can find somewhere in paperback or in a used bookstore. You'll find it if you look. It's a book called The Importance of Feeling Inferior. The Importance of Feeling Inferior. And if you think you have a special kind of insufficiency or inadequacy, you'll find in this study that there probably are dozens of very outstanding people who've dealt with the very insufficiency you have, whether it be a physical problem, whether it be a mental block, whether it be a bad memory, whatever it may be. The Importance of Feeling Inferior, and it was written by a woman by the name of Marie Beynon, B-E-Y-N-O-N, Ray. I think it's R-A-Y, Marie Beynon Ray. The Importance of Feeling Inferior. It's a very, very helpful book as a sort of a peripheral study to give great support to some of the things you deal with in your study of truth. Okay, that's enough for tonight. I've run over time, I'm sorry. All right, now let's get still for just a minute as we go on our way tonight. And let's remember that wherever you feel you have a great need, painful as it may be, that great need is a point in consciousness where you are most apt to experience the most productive growth. So let's right now, in humility and honesty, determine that we're going to look at these areas of greatest need and work on them in the realization that there is a sufficiency within us. There is meaning to our lives. There is the means by which we can solve and dissolve and resolve all of these concerns, not somewhere else, but within ourselves. Let's go on our way tonight just feeling good, feeling joyous, feeling clean, in the sense that we have relieved ourselves of the feeling of secret sin because we have some tremendous inadequacy, and resolving that we're going to let this concern over our insufficiency be a driving force in our life to lead us into greater accomplishment and overcoming than we've ever known. Accept the realization, I of myself can do nothing, but through the power of God in me, I can do all things. And so be it. Amen.